Aquilo. Special episode. The Macaron Sprite. I remember during my second spring in Aquilo, or was it my third? Anyways, it was that season I really got into French cuisine. I would never have admitted it then, but those were years during which I was still finding my footing as a cook. We tend not to think of cooking as an art. Or rather we do, but our attitude remains mostly utilitarian. Sure, baking a gorgeous moist cake or building an intricate piece of sugarwork has all the superficial elements of sculpture and painting, but only from a structural point of view. Cooks don't release albums or do gallery openings. Few will stop to consider a baker's emotional state or message while savoring a layered chiffon cake. In the same vein, the evolution of the cook isn't viewed with much more mystique than that of a mechanic or surgeon. Sure, we're expected to get better and learn new techniques, but our improvement is a linear road with only a few exits to explore tangents. Our itinerary is about the destination, not the journey. But all of these presumptions are wrong. Now, I'm not saying that every short-order cook is a culinary Rembrandt in the making. Some of us are just trying to make ends meet. And there is a significant portion of the best chefs in the world that are in it for the science, always looking for new ways to push boundaries of what can be done in a kitchen. They're the pioneers of the oven and the astronauts of the pantry. You wouldn't ask any of them to compare the texture of a creme pâtissière to that of clouds, or what song would best pair with what sauce. This is why, when I say I got into French cuisine, what I really mean is that I was going through my Parisian period, the same way Picasso had his blue period, and Warhol had a thing for cars during the time preceding his death. I spent a few weeks going deep into French patisserie. I can't tell you what triggered it. Maybe I had something to prove to myself, that I could match the works of some of the best chefs in the world. It might have been rebellion against the rich and robust, yet artless, meals that are traditional to spring in Quebec. Thick, butter-drenched pancakes drowning, Ophelia-like, in pools of maple syrup. Deep-fried, crispy pork rinds and quarter-inch thick slices of bacon, again drizzled in more maple syrup. Delicious meals that are the food equivalent of an airbrushed landscape on the side of a minivan. No one can blame me for wanting to test myself against the fine arts. So, starting somewhere in mid-March, I dusted off my books from Paul Bocuse and my trusty copy of Mastering the Art of French Cooking, the one with all the post-it notes marking Louisette Berthol's recipes, and went all the way back to the basics. It was worth it, too. I remember the way my ego soared when even Ian, the leader of the cloud-worshipping Pilvists, not only noticed, but complimented the improvement in my already delicious croissants. And this is a man who should know. He'd easily eaten over 500 of my croissants by that time, one a day from the first week I moved to Aquilo. Never had he commented further than the expected gratitude. On that Monday morning, when I pulled out the first batch of my new and improved models, however, he was positively gushing at the subtle, buttery accents. Croissants were only the first salvo. Soon I was doing eclairs and a Paris-Brest. I'd opened the shop with mille-feuilles of a dozen variety, like chocolate or with fresh seasonal fruits. All things I'd done before, but on a whole new level. The impact on my clientele was almost immediate. There weren't more customers. The steady stream of Aquilo denizens remained the same as the previous year, increasing their flow with the warming of the weather, much like the local river swells with snowmelt for the same reason. The difference came in how long each of them would stay. Orléans and Alessandria would no longer leave after sharing a cookie and drinking their tea and coffee. Instead, they would linger around, sitting calmly in their blue suits to enjoy a flan. Timothy Greer, a local accountant and aggressively vocal stamp collector, made it a habit to leave the Aquilo with a half-dozen apple palmiers after every visit. My experimentation led to increased production, and yet it wasn't enough to meet demand. Needless to say, I was pleased with the situation and may have let it go to my head a little. "It's your coffee shop," Olivia said, raising her voice over the unusual racket in my dining room. You do what you want with it, dear. But, I asked, handing a small box of eclairs to a customer before taking their money. But nothing. Olivia then did that thing where she raises her mug to hide her features. It's her signature move when she's lying. Or maybe lying is a harsh word. Being coy would be more appropriate, certainly more polite, but it also lacks the bite Olivia sneaks into it. Now that I know better, I think it's safe to call it mischief. It's not a perfect word. I've yet to find one after all these years. It's as close as I think I'll get without inventing a new one. Out with it, I demanded, holding the coffee pot away from her, a delicious and addictive hostage. Fine, she relented, sliding her cup forward on the counter to be refilled. Look at your dining room. What do you see? Ears perked, listening to the filling cup, I surveyed my domain. The place was packed. Packed in a way I may or may not wish it still was these days. The register doesn't ring as loud and as often now, but I think I'm at peace with that. Happy for the quiet, lonely times. Back then, though, all I could see across the Aquilo Cafe's dining room was revenue. I smiled at my own reply. It wasn't really a joke. The Aquilo had gone through some ups and downs by then. I was on my second or third employee to help out and give me some time off. Thinking of profits before community wasn't the most heartwarming of approaches, but when a business becomes your livelihood, romantic thoughts of the little rural shop that subsists on passion and dedication are soon banished. And what happens if you turn half this place into a pastry shop? Where do all these people go, taking their revenue with them? When I first got to Aquilo, I had no sense of running a business, but I was pig-headed enough to think that I could figure it out on my own. Since then, I've seen a few other entrepreneurs and how they handle their commercial ventures. Olivia Figg and her husband Henry are some of the more successful of these. And those days were when the foundation of their Apple empire was poured. The concrete still took time to set, and there's certainly a few cracks that formed along the way, but few will doubt how sturdy the palace of Figg's orchard truly is now. Home, I guess, but they'll come back, right? Olivia gently blew over the surface of her fresh cup before pouring in a bit of cream and a single, precisely measured teaspoon of sugar. Never forget, she said, looking up at me with those deep brown eyes that said she meant business. You don't sell coffee and pastries. You sell an experience. Students don't pay you $5 for a pecan sandy and a cup of coffee. They pay for a place to sit and study, the ambiance you provide, and the chance to get another cookie, croissant, or sandwich whenever the whim takes them. The same can be said of every single one of the people you see here. Cut that in half to sell boxes of products, and what do you think happens to that ambiance, that charm? It's cut in half? It wasn't greed that drove me to want to sell cookies and pastries. It wasn't that harebrained of an idea either. People get cakes and cookies to go all the time, and there was already a small bookshelf filled with ciders, apple butters, and apple tarts that I sold as a collaboration with the Figs. It's the freedom. In those days, the dream of becoming a chef of international renown burned bright inside me. That Paris period of mine was only one of many artistic explorations I wanted to experience on the way to becoming that chef. But if I was going to be spending days in the kitchen, learning and honing my skills, trying out new things and pushing the limits of expression one can need out of a French loaf, I needed time. And as it turns out, time is something you can buy. Are we sure this isn't one of those preserve Doris's legacy things? I asked Olivia. Not an unfair question. Between her and Helen Edna, notary public, the two women had taken up the mantle of defending what Doris had built. Already, the Aquilo was unrecognizable from when I inherited it. Any further changes certainly did not sit well with the traditionalists. Olivia considered the question, tossing a curious glance at the glass display where I spread out the various snacks and desserts that were on offer. Her thin eyebrows arched to signify that there was no surprise in what she saw. As long as you can't provide me with a decent biscotti, the legacy of Doris Dufour will always remain uncertain. She went there. I get it now. I've cracked the secret of Doris's biscotti recipe. But back in those days, it was one of the most frustrating failures of my cooking career. And Olivia knew it. Oh, I've given up on those, I lied. You're the only one who doesn't like the biscotti I make anyways. I've become certain that you're the problem. She said, nodding her sarcasm in my direction. I'm sure that's it. Maybe once you're done with the French revival, you'll indulge us with a bit of the Italian Renaissance and give me a biscotti worthy of your coffee. In the meantime, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind trying one of those macarons. An innocuous request, don't you think? Let me try one of those macarons. When I heard her speak, for a second, I even thought to comply, but there was a catch. You see, despite all my other adventures into the finer arts of French baking and patisserie, there was one thing I'd yet to bother trying. I couldn't serve Olivia Fig any macarons because I hadn't baked any. Ha ha, I answered with a mischievous smile of my own. Is there anything you really want, or is the coffee enough for now? I made some pommiers with your apples if you want to try one. Her smile remained for a time, but there was an air of worry that spoiled the cheer of a good tease. Holding onto the counter, Olivia bent back to take another look at the display next to her. She said with a chuckle. No, I'll have 2 macarons. The brown ones are coffee or chocolate? Her left hand reached over, and with acrylic nails she tapped on the glass, just about knee-height. If this was a joke, Olivia was carrying it pretty far. There was no way "made ya look" was going to be a payoff worthy of the deception. As far as pranks were concerned, this lacked the wit and sophistication I'd expect from her. Not that Olivia was prone to such antics, but if she was going to bother... Eager to put an end to this jest, I stepped aside and crouched down. The harsh light of the display was almost blinding, obscuring the dining room on the other side of the glass. Sitting on my heels, I slowly peered over the rim of the metal mesh shelves and into the baskets of baked goods and cookies. I expected to see some pastries and cakes, waiting patiently for their ultimate destiny while resting on sage green gingham paper. Maybe one of the baskets would be empty. But it wasn't. Just as Olivia had said, there, in my display, were macarons. A couple dozen of them, in 4 different colors and flavors, some deep red and some light minty green. Several were a dark tan and could indeed have been either chocolate or coffee. The tastiest looked to be the bright orange ones. I had no idea what they were meant to be flavored with, but they looked refreshing and zesty. But that's the thing. I should have known what kind of macarons they were. I should have been able to identify the brown ones and tell Olivia if they were indeed either coffee or chocolate. Except I couldn't. These were not my macarons. I wished they were. Every single one was a work of art. Perfect smooth domes of baked meringue without a single crack, sandwiching fresh-flavored ganache and jellies that glistened under the display's light. I'd never seen anything like them. And I certainly had never made anything like this. How? I mumbled, bewildered. How did you do that? It could have been anything. This was Aquilo, after all. Did she get someone to sneak them in while I was fetching a sandwich or some soup from the kitchen? Was it some kind of genuine magic trick she wanted to show off? Hell, it was just as likely that she managed to bribe a raccoon into pulling it off. Though, I can't think of a single one of those furry little bastards who wouldn't have eaten the macarons instead of sneaking them into the display. How did I do what? It was a genuine question, as honest as mine in its confusion. Of course, I didn't see it that way. I was, at first, amused, a little jealous, and curious as to where these beautiful meringue gems had originated, but not yet full-blown irritated. That was about to change. A customer was standing at the counter, waiting for me to get up and offer him some service. I already knew what he wanted. Elijah Gilman, a pilvist. He was going to order a cup of green tea with a cloud of milk and a drop of honey. With that, he'll ask for the soup of the day, Act disappointed no matter what I say it is, yet orderable regardless. I pulled myself to my feet, eager to question Olivia further on her prank, but I put my customers first. Because Elijah wasn't alone. I hadn't noticed how late the day was drawing, and a small lineup of after-dinner customers was forming at the door. People who, after their evening meal, decided they wanted something sweet and perhaps a refreshment or two before letting the night take its course. "Onion soup again, Mr. Gilman," I announced, happy to anticipate the question. I was already about to turn to get him some hot water and a tea bag when, for the first time, there was a deviation. People in Aquilo make a big deal out of their usual orders. I'm always happy when my varied menu manages to shake them into trying something new. Except, did I hear you say macarons? Elijah asked. He did, of course. And, as I just discovered myself, I had macarons in stock. So, of course, I'd be willing to sell him as many as he wanted, but this wasn't a supply and demand thing. This was a pride thing. Sure, I had macarons, but they weren't my macarons, and that irritated me more than sand and buttercream. I suppose you did. The delighted look on his face only added to the sting. Oh, how wonderful. Can I have a box of a dozen? My wife absolutely adores macarons. What about your tea? What about your soup? I wanted to ask. Instead, I cast a blistering look at Olivia for putting me in this embarrassing situation. Now, people were going to be ordering these perfect macarons. Assuming they're anywhere near as good tasting as they are good looking, they'll be asking for more later. And if I fail to deliver on the same level of delicate craft and bake, I'm going to look like an idiot. Sure, I say, stretching my lips and displaying my teeth, a pale imitation of a sincere smile. Stupid prank macarons, I thought, gathering 3 of each, piling them delicately into a box. These weren't my macarons, but they were in a box with my logo, and there was no end to how frustrating that was. Being the smart and forward-thinking person I was, I set aside an additional specimen of each flavor for my own sampling. Oh, it would be a bitter tasting filled with judgment on the quest to find every little thing wrong with these little marvels. Even before taking the first nibble out of the first macaron, I already wanted to claim they weren't that good. "Here you go," I said, handing Elijah the box. "That'll be $25. I had to improvise the price. Not that it mattered. They weren't my macarons, so they never cost me anything in ingredients or labor. But still, will there be anything else? But there wasn't. And Elijah left with his box of prank macarons, as happy as a pilvist with a fresh croissant. Taking his place was Lisa Aikita, one of the sweetest women in Aquilo. She owns a private language school on the U.S. side of the border, where she gives lessons in French, English, German, and Japanese. Coffee with 1 sugar and 3 creams to go, and chocolate chip cookies if I baked any that day. "Hi," she said, radiant as ever. "I'll have my coffee and 3 of those macarons." I should have asked if she had any specific ones in mind, but I was too worried she'd inquire about the flavor. How was I going to answer that? Green, brown, red, and orange flavored? What if the orange ones are peach? Or salted caramel? So I just went back to the display and hoped she'd be happy with whatever selection I gave her, which of course was going to be completely arbitrary. Pastry bag in one hand, wax paper in the other, I crouched down for the 3rd time, a little glad that I might be rid of the offending treats quickly enough. How many were left? 8? 10? With a sigh, I pulled out the basket and reached deep into the display to grab whatever random assortment I could for Lisa. I expected to have to fumble around a little. That was always the case with cookies and sandies. The ones at the bottom were hard to see at this angle and difficult to get a hold of. Except not these guys. In fact, when I pulled the basket completely out of the display, I discovered that there weren't the 6 remnants I had imagined. Oh no. There were, at a glance, at least 3 dozen. And no longer were they limited to the 4 flavors I'd sold Elijah Gilman. Now I saw deep brown macarons, blue macarons, cream-colored macarons. I had to think, actively think, to remember if it was the 1st of April. What kind of prank was this? And why? But I had no time to investigate. The buyers were waiting, and as long as I had inventory, I might as well sell it. The more mystery macarons I sold, the more demand there was, making me wonder if the whole town was in on it. More mysterious and frustrating was how every time I came close to emptying the display of these intrusive treats, more seemed to pop up out of nowhere. It was as if the macarons were reproducing as fast as I was selling them. A couple here, a dozen there, and by the time the evening was over and the line of customers dwindled to nothing, I must have sold 200 of these perfect, colorful meringues. Considering every sale was pure profit, it was hard to complain. Okay, I finally managed to ask Olivia. What was that all about? The woman kept a straight face, and with but a little bemusement, she pulled a few bills from her purse to pay her evening's bill. Honey, she said, I have no idea why you think I would pull something like that, or where I would even find the money for it. That was a lot of macarons you sold. When did you even find the time to make them all? What? I didn't make them. Olivia put the strap of her massive purse over her shoulder before buttoning up her spring jacket. Who's been baking her way through the French repertoire? It was as easy as it was frustrating to know where this conversation was going to go, so I kept quiet and let her finish. And who in Aquilo could come close to making a good macaron, let alone one as perfect as these? She took a step back as if about to leave, but instead waved one of her ring-laden hands at the display, which wasn't just filled with 4 dozen macarons again, but was now otherwise devoid of anything else. All my pommiers, millefeuille, and every last one of my garden variety chocolate chip cookies were gone, replaced by a rainbow of macarons. And right there, smack dab in the middle of them all, busy arranging the sweet little discs like a gardener tending rows of flowers, was a strange little creature. I thought for a second that it might have been a rat, because it was too small to be a raccoon. But few rats I know have pastel fur in baby blue and violet hues, nor do they have little wings with flowers growing out of their flesh. In fact, this thing looked more like a salamander or Amazonian frog than anything one would expect to find around these parts. I was shocked, of course, but not as horrified as I might have been before my tenure in Aquilo. The presence of the creature did nothing to answer my questions about the macarons. In fact, they added another to the list. What the hell is that? I don't like asking for help. Never have, never will. The list of ways in which I'm willing to make myself feel vulnerable is short and concise. A fraction of my average grocery list and a few items short of the ingredients for sugar cookies. In that way, I'm like the raccoons. I prize my independence above almost anything else, and I hate to owe favors. Even Brioche, my favorite of the raccoons and the one to whom I would gladly hand over a tray of cookies, still steals from me from time to time. It used to enrage me how I'd find the back lock picked and the door ajar. Sometimes something would be missing from the display case. Other times it would be a plastic bin from the refrigerator that had been ransacked. Every time it was the raccoons. After a few years, I accepted that this was simply in their nature, as immutable as my need to bake or Doris's drive to help the helpless. I could no more bribe it out of them as I could convince Olivia and Henry to stop growing apples. One does not simply switch off the sun. Once in a while, though, I run across something in Aquilo that has me going down my contact list to find a good Samaritan. I can find how to unclog a drain on the internet and fix that myself, but when it comes to burst pipes, I'm calling a plumber. Or, in local terms, I can banish the occasional ghost or even handle a demon in a pinch, but when confronted with something new and unusual, I like to bring in the experts. Are you sure about this? Olivia and I sat back in the empty dining room, lights dimmed and chairs empty, Half-full mugs and crumb-covered plates dotted the landscape of tables waiting to be picked up and brought to the dishwasher. Each crumpled napkin testifying to a customer hurried out the door as I tried to close the Aquilo Cafe early in order to take care of the creature. "I certainly am not," I answered, fingers fidgeting with the hem of my apron. My wooden kitchen spoon lay on the table between us, like a weapon allowed to rest but kept ready and vigilant. "Last time these two tried to help, they got the place completely trashed," I added. And almost got you killed." We both watched as a short, round man in an impeccable blue suit carefully put a macaron in a plastic bag. His partner, tall like an Amazon but with the attitude of an irate grizzly bear, nodded approvingly. Orleans and Alessandria. The Inquisition. Both were ordained members of that secretive organization, sworn to hunt down and eliminate witches, warlocks, and worshippers of devils and demons. Their weapons were less the sword and flail, but rather a dazzling array of bureaucratic and legislative pressures designed to break their victims. Or bore them to death. "But," I continued, face contorted in a frown as I watched the Inquisitors leaning down in front of the display, "if you don't know what that thing is, that doesn't leave me a whole lot of options." Orleans unbuttoned his jacket and tugged his pant legs before crouching down to sit on his heels. His fingers tapped on the glass, tilting his head to get a better view. "It's another demon," Alessandria declared with undeserved authority. "I suppose it could be," Orleans answered, putting his face flat against the display. "It does have wings, and it is performing miracles normally reserved for our Lord or saints, but—" "No buts. If it's a demon, it is our holy duty to eliminate it. I, for one, will not suffer one of hell's minions to live. I will burn it to the ground and salt the earth touched by the abomination and leave nothing behind." I interrupted her. It wasn't the first time I'd seen the tall Inquisitor froth at the mouth like this. I'd yet to unravel what it is that made Alessandria such a trembling volcano, always on the edge of eruption. There's a balance to being a kitchen witch in Aquilo, a tightrope walk between therapist and baker that I had yet to master. Not only was I unqualified to peel the layers and reveal the Inquisitor's secrets, but I was also uninterested in the task. I saw her as a threat, Orleans' rabid dog, violent and unpredictable. "You had a taste of that once," I explained, as cool as I could pretend to be. "That dish cost you the price of a new kitchen and dining room. Do you really want to go back for seconds?" And like a dog, she bared her teeth. From across the room, I doubt she could bite, but even so, I took a half step back. Now, Orleans piped up, ever the peacemaker. "We were asked for assistance, and that is what we'll provide." He turned to me and beamed a smile as reassuring as his counterpart's bark was menacing. "Besides, I don't think this is a demon at all." Like rolling thunder, Alessandria's growl shook the air, but Orleans' words were like a lightning rod, attracting her blinding anger towards him. "How can you be so sure?" Orleans didn't answer. Instead, he took a quick stroll to the table nearest the entrance. It was the first time I could get a good look at the display since the Inquisitor's arrival. The two of them had been crowding in front, studying the phenomenon behind the glass, whispering to each other while taking copious notes. The display had become a kaleidoscopic mess. Gone were the ordered rows of rainbow colors. The multitude of macarons stacked with military precision, like soldiers on parade, each color representing its own battalion, were gone. In their stead, disorganized piles of random discs crowded the baskets behind the glass. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of macarons in every conceivable shade and hue, and presumably flavor, formed mountains that blended into an amorphous mass. From a distance, it was almost impossible to pick out the creature. Only when it moved, a fluttering of fuchsia and cerulean, would it stand out from the explosion of baked treats. A thought materialized into my mind. A concept so foreign to me that, at first, I couldn't believe my brain had conceived of it. But as the words had not been spoken by anyone, yet were clear in my head, they had to have come from me. That's too many macarons. Too many macarons. Too many to eat and too many to sell. Too many to even store. The clatter of a metal basket falling from the back of the display startled me. My hand reached for the spoon on the table as if it were an adequate weapon against the impossible scenario unfolding before me. I could hear the macarons spilling to the floor behind the counter, yet the swarm of colors in the display remained unchanged. Not even all the raccoons in Aquilo could eat all of this.
"Oh my,"
Orleans said, setting a large briefcase down on the counter.
"Things are quickly getting out of hand, aren't they?"
He punctuated his question with the cold metallic click of fasteners being released on his briefcase. It was a familiar and unwelcome sight. Late at night, an unknown yet clearly supernatural threat, and the Inquisition unpacking their artillery in my dining room. The flap of the briefcase had yet to be opened, but already I was dreading the appearance of Orleans' machine gun. It had been a year since I'd seen the hardware, but as an artsy cooking student from Montreal, firearms weren't a sight I was used to. They still aren't, despite having seen my fair share by now. The response seemed disproportionate to the threat. Unleashing a hail of bullets into a pocket-sized demon was overkill, especially if, like last time, it was going to take half of my cafe with it. Hey. I stood, wooden spoon in hand, and walked over to the Inquisitor. No need for that. However, as he turned around, pulling out what I thought was a weapon, Orleans was not holding a gun. I couldn't immediately understand what he had in his hands. At first, it looked like a stack of brass rods, randomly packed together along with an inch-thick polished mahogany disc. Before getting an explanation, I already knew I would like this device much better than any weapon the Inquisitors could have otherwise deployed, mostly based on the disappointed look on Alessandria's face. "Oh, no," she said, contracting her features in disgust. "Not that."
"If it's not a demon, dear Aless, then that leaves very few options."
Orleans gave his explanation after putting the brass contraption on the counter between the half-empty plates of cookies and a lonely mug of abandoned coffee. He pinched a polished golden ball between his short thumb and index finger and, with a flourish, pulled the whole apparatus together in one smooth motion. A cage. As gilded as they come. The brass rods came together, following as Orleans lifted the gold ball and unfolding into delicate bars with ornate crosses between each. The whole thing came erect like a clever origami trick, clicking into place after reaching its full height. Almost a foot tall, the device had turned into a gleaming bird cage covered in Christian imagery cut into the brass. Orleans gave a final twist of his hand, securing the apparatus together with a hidden locking mechanism.
"And what in nature's name is that thing, little man?"
It was Olivia who'd gotten up to join us. She knew the Inquisition, had warned me against them in the past. She'd warned me against asking for their help that day, too.
"The Cage of St. Gallen,"
Orleans boasted, puffing out his chest.
"I had it sent to us when we last had to deal with a creature like this one. I was hoping for a chance to use it, and when you called, I knew the day had come."
I don't claim to know about much. Okay, fine. I do claim to know just about everything there is to know about cooking and baking, but I've earned that level of arrogance through sweat and blood. Today, I'd even say I'm a pretty good witch in my own right. Well-traveled, too. And that's exactly my point. I know food, and I know people. They're the two founding pillars of the unique little profession that is owning the Aquilo Cafe. I can tell when to flip a steak just by the sound of its sizzle, and I knew, when I heard Orleans speak of his so-called Cage of St. Gallen, there was hunger in his voice.
"It takes no less than 12 different forms submitted in writing, in triplicate, to put in the request for this artifact."
Night was deep outside the Aquilo, but Orleans could have lit it back up, so much he beamed through his explanation.
"The submittal of a request is by far no guarantee of acceptance and surrender. That this holy relic made its way from the Vatican vault of marble to this village is a miracle unto itself. Look closely at the bars."
Olivia and I both squinted and leaned in a little, but it wasn't enough to satisfy the Inquisitor's excitement.
"Closer, closer! Look, see how each thin bar is inlaid with hair-thin metal filigree? Those are of the purest iron the 6th century could produce. And if you study the lines with care, you can see that they spell out Bible verses. Would you like to know which ones I've already deciphered?
I've seen a laundry list of wonders since that day with the macarons, and I've witnessed and even wielded more than my share of venerable instruments and finely crafted antiques. The cage of St. Gallen remains one of the more striking of these items. The mechanism that allows it to collapse and unfold with the twist of a knob, the workmanship to inscribe all the cursive letters into the brass bars. No doubt a lifetime of work and dedication went into crafting this work of art. Even knowing its purpose today, I still can't cleanse the beauty of its sight from my mind. Yet, upon the offer of hearing a list of what Orleans had managed to read of the inscriptions, Olivia and I both looked at each other and with one voice told him a firm no. The pride wasn't quite knocked off Orleans' face, but the more familiar version of him bubbled to the surface once more.
Oh,
he said, twisting his fingers together in confusion.
Well, I guess we could keep that for another time. But I assure you, some of the choices are quite interesting. One particular juxtaposition had Alessandria in stitches when I told her.
The idea of the taller inquisitor laughing was as foreign a concept to me then as it is now. It is hilarious, she confirmed, her tone devoid of any mirth. While I didn't share the wonder over the particular verses etched, iron on brass, into the bars of the cage, I did hold some measure of reverence towards the contraption. And Orleans said 6th century? He had. The age alone was enough to invite wonder, but there was something else about the cage that teased at my brain. I was maybe 2 years into the whole kitchen witch thing. I'd seen a few items that might pass for enchanted by then. There were sprinklings of some magic in the spoons the previous Dufour women had used, and the mayors of Aquilot's sword whispered quiet hints that it too was more than mere metal and leather. But both utensils and weapon were plain. Their magic came from wear and tear, the intent baked into them through years and years of use and a deep link with their owner. The cage of St. Gallen was completely unlike anything else. This device had intent built into it. It was designed and forged for purpose, every line of its intricate decoration traced into the bars. And for some reason, that made it ominous. The purest of iron. Why did you go through so much trouble to get a fancy cage? I asked, unable to pull my eyes from the brass antique. White bats, Alessandria answered. Have you not seen the white bats in the park? I think I have. Really? Olivia cut in, slipping herself between the Inquisitor and myself. That old tale? She then turned to me. White bats are supposed to be the herald of the arrival of a witch in town. They were there before you arrived, Miss Dufour. The accusation was a familiar one, and one I thought we'd already dismissed. Ah, the Inquisition. They are nothing if not ever vigilant. I've seen the bats, I said, looking over Olivia's head and into Alessandria's eyes. I saw a flock of them last summer, so if they're still here, then whatever they herald has yet to arrive. The Inquisitor narrowed her eyes, looking for the lie in my words. All I could think was how easy it was for her to unbury the hatchet.
Well,
Orleans interfered to my relief.
Whatever original purpose prompted us to secure the cage of St. Gallen, we can now use it to capture your little friend here, all without having to inflict any harm to your cafe.
Convenient.
The Lord works in mysterious ways, he smiled. And I, for one, am glad of it. This is the best coffee and tea in town. It's always torture when you have to close your doors for any length of time.
Even Alessandria gave a nod of agreement to that. What do you plan on doing with it, if you catch it? I had to ask. While Orleans could be pleasant, he and his partner were, after all, violent, gun-toting zealots. Their rules were strict and their ways bizarre, but they were one of the most volatile elements in the mix that made up Aquilot.
This thing?
Orleans asked, picking up the cage.
Probably set it free somewhere in the forest. Let it find its way home.
That was not what I expected. I stole a glance toward Alessandria, fully expecting that she too would be taken aback by the pacifist direction her partner was taking. But she seems to have expected that response. Really? Olivia asked, sharing my incredulity.
Oh, absolutely,
Orleans reassured.
Aless and I aren't equipped to deal with this sort of creature. And besides, our particular branch of the church prefers to stay clear of the affairs of fairies.
I thought, for a brief moment, that Orleans was kidding. Of course, I had already seen all manner of strange things in Aquilo, and, if I must be honest, I sort of suspected the creature was something of that nature. The thing is, though, that with every little new discovery, the walls of the world move just a little farther, and my horizons need to move along with them. Eventually, the room becomes too big, and I start to just feel a little lost on the open floor.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Orleans didn't reply immediately. Still enthralled by his relic, he placed one hand flat under the polished mahogany disc that made the floor of the cage in order to support it. Then, with a gingerly pinch, he squeezed the handle of the door and pulled it open. With great satisfaction, he nodded his approval at how smooth the ancient device operated so far. I can feel the look on his face from my own muscle memory. I wore that same expression once, the first time I operated a stand mixer while at school. Above even my acceptance letter, it was standing in the class kitchen, polished steel all around me and cracking eggs into a bowl while the Cuisinart did all the mixing, that I truly realized that I was studying cooking at a prestigious school. A stand mixer is just a machine, and Orleans' artifact is just a cage. But I could appreciate the clean satisfaction of operating something wonderful that functions as well, if not better, than anticipated.
Fairies,
he repeated.
There are, after all, more things in heaven and earth than—
Spare me the platitudes. I remember interrupting him very clearly. It was the second time in one evening that I'd stepped all over his joy, and that wasn't something I relished doing to the one inquisitor that didn't show me open hostility. However, I wasn't in much of a mood for quotes worthy of a first-year drama student. If that's a fairy making macarons, does that mean my customers, who spent the whole afternoon scarfing them down, are in danger? The inquisitors exchanged a look, a mannerism of theirs I've since learned to dread, and shrugged.
I don't know,
Orleans offered.
Probably not. How do you feel, Ms. Fig?
Ms. Fig did not offer an immediate answer. In fact, Olivia, who is more often than not the person I turn to when looking for a sturdy anchor or stable footing, was as pale as a ghost. The woman who had uttered the word demon to me on my first night in Aquilo, and who had, so far, been unflappable at the mention of ghosts and fairies, was as pale as uncooked bread.
She hesitated. I feel fine. Should I not feel fine?
It was Alessandria who, uncharacteristically, offered the most reassuring take on the subject. The macarons aren't fairy food. They're a byproduct of the Sprite's presence. If you ate food offered to you in the fairy court, then you'd be running a risk. At the very worst, you've eaten something else glamoured into looking and tasting like a macaron. For the better part of a very long minute, we all just stared at her in silence. Even Orleans, who seemed to spend every waking moment with his partner, looked stunned by the depth of her explanation.
I'm allowed to read things other than the Bible,
the tall inquisitor protested. Her upper lip curled into a snarl, and her neck quivered with tension, ready to channel a louder and harsher protest at the slightest provocation.
Orleans offered, hesitating. We should get this over with.
I procured a pastry. I want to say it was a maple strudel from the previous day that I'd kept in the kitchen, but if I'm honest, that doesn't sound right. I'd probably have given that kind of leftover treat to the raccoons. So perhaps it was a cookie or something else. It doesn't matter right now. The important thing is, we set bait in the cage of Saint Gallen and Orleans set it next to the display case. Left unsupervised while we argued about relics and fairies, the storage behind the glass had reached and exceeded the limits of its capacity. A rainbow avalanche had spread to cover almost a third of the tiles behind the counter. The smell of meringues and sugar wafted strong, pulled up by the ventilation system. If this was a glamour of look and taste, it was a convincing one that extended to all the other senses. Part of me couldn't help but run a quick estimation as to the ridiculous value that many macarons, magically perfect macarons, represented. There was enough here to sate even the hunger of a town with a sweet tooth of Aquilo. Though, with his wide variety of colors and flavors, it would take a while for a customer to sample everything. I tried to shake the idea from my mind, opting instead to watch with Olivia and the Inquisitors in the hopes that the fairy took the bait. We hunkered down in the kitchen, peering through the door kept propped open with a milk crate. It felt silly, like we were a bunch of kids hiding in the dark to spy on a neighbor, waiting for something to happen. We didn't have to wait long. Emerging from the hundreds of macarons as if it were digging itself out of a collapsed building, the little blue and purple Sprite climbed out from beneath the mountain of treats. Gold eyes looked around like a rabbit, scanning for predators while leaving its warren. It flitted tiny wings with speeds that would put a hummingbird to shame. We could even hear them, like a fat bumblebee, buzzing with the effort. The creature was holding one of its own macarons in one hand, still chewing a bite from the sugary confection. Its belly looked rounder and more full than when first I saw it. Yet, even fat on its own creations, the little Sprite sniffed at the air, sensing another feast. A brownie! Now I remember. It was the leftover half of a peanut butter brownie I was saving for myself. I had some ice cream in the freezer, ready to become an accompaniment to this dessert. Alas, now it was going to be fairy food. The Sprite made a brief but valiant attempt to fly, flitting its small wings with vigor. It went so far as to drop the half-eaten macaron from its hand. At this point, it was too heavy with the meringue and ganache, reduced to making the journey to the cage of Saint Gallen on foot. With every few steps, the fairy would stop, look around, and sniff at the air. It could sense that something was wrong, and I have to admit, for a moment, I felt a pang of pity for the little guy. Sure, I had to get rid of it, and yeah, Orléans had promised to set it free, but the innocent way it walked, fearful but unable to resist the lure of my brownie, I felt guilty. A large hand with thin yet strong fingers gripped my shoulder, pushing me down before I even knew I wanted to stand up. Alessandria squeezed a warning that I should not interrupt the ambush, especially not with our quarry sniffing at the hinges and frame of the cage's door. The tiny creature spent several minutes studying the cage, getting close then pulling back, only to approach again. Alessandria's fingers, still wrapped around my shoulder, dug deeper into my joint the more impatient she got. The strap of my apron dug into my skin like a tight belt after a 7-course meal. I endured it, not out of stamina or strength of character, but because of how wholly engrossing the spectacle was. While the Inquisitor might have thought this a waste of her time, questions wrestled in my mind. How will the door to the cage close? Also, wasn't there something about fairies and iron? What happens when you back a supernatural creature into a corner? In the end, the aroma of my brownie did triumph over prudence for the Sprite. Of course it did. I wasn't any more modest about my baking then than I am now. Why should I be? But that did make me that much more responsible for what happened next. The fairy, wings aflutter to help it climb over the ledge, made its way into the cage. I kept a paw across the threshold, stretching to reach the brownie. When that proved useless, it left but the tip of its tail to do the job. That was a mistake. How can I describe what the cage of Saint Gallen did next? It screamed like hot metal poured over ice. The iron inlays glowed a golden light for a few heartbeats, and then the Sprite let out a pitiful yelp, drawing its tail through the opening and into the cage. It's as if the surface of the bars had become incandescent with heat, burning the fragile appendage in the process. My memories might have very well embellished the story, but I may have even heard a brief sizzle. The threshold clear and the prey well within the cage, the door shut on its own, compelled, I suppose, by the same will that crafted it centuries ago.
"We got it!"
Orléans yelled, victorious. If I heard hunger in his voice at the prospect of using his relic, it was now replaced by the singular joy a 6-year-old feels when being handed an ice cream cone. That purest of moments before a great and well-anticipated pleasure is about to be enjoyed. A more naive version of me, perhaps a few years younger, would have thought the analogy delightful. Looking at the prey, its eyes wide and its head swiveling left to right in panic. I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The Macaron Sprite, as I decided to call it in the moment, did not simply accept its fate and go quietly. Oh no. It first threw itself at the door to the cage, hoping perhaps that if it were quick enough, it might defy time and escape in the previous seconds when the door was still open. Then it wrapped its tiny hands around the thin brass bars in an attempt to pry the door open. The price of that attempt was another scream on its part, as this time its fingers and palms were singed. I wish it had let up at that point, that the Sprite had accepted its situation, sat down in the middle of the cage, away from the iron inlays, and perhaps snacked on some brownie as a consolation prize. Instead, likely prompted by the sight of Orléans racing to collect his prize, the fairy doubled down on its effort. Tiny golden eyes wide with panic, the Sprite shrugged its shoulders. Its tiny chest heaved as it took a deep breath, bracing itself for what would come next, and then it took another go at the door. There was no yelp, but instead a long, sustained scream as the Macaron Sprite held on tight to the bars. Tendrils of purple smoke rose from its burning palms. The air smelled of overdone caramel left too long on the stove, and I tried to stand once more to put an end to this insanity. A hand held me down once again, but not Alessandria's. No, that time it was Olivia. I turned my head towards her, ready to plead to let go. What manner of human being with even an ounce of compassion would allow this to continue? Surely she understood what I had to do. But her eyes didn't move to meet mine. She kept staring, studying with frozen fear the unfolding events as Orléans finally reached the cage of St. Gallen. In one swift and victorious movement, he swept the relic from the ground at the base of the Macaron landslide. His polished leather shoes kicked up a few of the treats, tossing a small rainbow of sweets scattering across the tiles. "Shh," he whispered to the Sprite, holding the cage up so his eyes could be level with his captive. He even pushed the creature away from the bars, shoving it back to end its torment.
"There's no need for any of that. You're just hurting yourself."
Olivia's hand fell off my shoulder as I rose to my feet. I was about to take a step forward, to go investigate for myself how hurt the little creature was, when I saw it leap. A tiny bound, but clear across the bottom of the cage. It didn't go for the door this time, finally having learned its lesson. Instead, it went for Orléans' finger, and took a bite. You deserved that, I thought. What a piece of wonderful schadenfreude to see him punished for the pain he inflicted on the Sprite. The Inquisitor yelled his pain, and for a second I thought him a wimp for how loud he screamed. That was before I saw the blood. So much blood. The Macaron Sprite must have taken a piece of Orléans' fingertip clean off to account for the arcing stream of blood that came out of it. Still, the Inquisitor held tight, not dropping the cage despite the obvious pain. Still, he knew better than to put his fingers between the bars, and hopefully the fairy knew better than to touch them. With any luck, this was going to be the end of the story, and Orléans could make good on his promise to release the fairy back into nature. Somewhere safe, near a ring of mushrooms, perhaps. I was on my way to lend a hand when this time both my shoulders were held back. Olivia and Alessandria, with such synchronicity that it could have passed as rehearsed, put their hands back on my shoulders and pulled me back. They did so with such vigor that I spun around, tired of them keeping me from interfering. If it wasn't for them, I might have been able to stop Orléans from bleeding all over my dining room floor.
"What do you two think you're
I stopped. Neither was looking at me. Olivia no longer wore the serious, worried expression she'd had earlier, and Alessandria was an Amazon of a woman. Not only in height and power, but also her attitude. She was a warrior, a zealous fighter for her cause, which was, I often had to remind myself, to eradicate witches and witchcraft. But that was stripped from her in that moment, and when I turned back again, I could see why. The mountain of spilled macarons was coming alive. Quivers and quakes manifested across its surface, causing macaron slides and macaron avalanches. Tremors shook the treats in a dozen, No, 24 places. Maybe more. A mound of orange, peach, and brown-colored macarons fell to pieces at the base of the mountain, leaving behind a gaping hole. First one tiny pink hand protruded from the cavern, then another, and finally, pulling free of the macarons, another Sprite dug itself out. Another macaron, a violet one, slid down high on the pile, revealing the head of a bright lime-green Sprite with tangerine eyes. This went on for a few more seconds, unveiling a veritable swarm of the creatures.
"Oh,"
Orleans said, lacking much of the appropriate level of alarm for the situation.
We only have the one cage."
Only when the massive amount of sprites, all of one mind, took flight did the Inquisitor begin to realize the situation he was in.
"Orleans,"
I said, trying to be quiet but needing to be heard.
"Drop the cage."
"Do it, Orleans," Alessandria seconded me. I think that, given enough time, perhaps a second or two more, Orleans would have dropped his precious relic. It meant not only abandoning the prize inside, but very possibly damaging an artifact centuries old and facing whatever amount of paperwork it took to report the loss to the church. It's probably all of that which went through his mind instead of making the swift, life-saving decision to let the cage go. In that moment of hesitation, the Sprite struck. Like a collapsing prism of broken hues, the small army of sprites swarmed to Orleans. At first, he was more than able to bat them away, sending 2 sprites, one brown and one lavender, crashing back into their mountain of macarons. His bloody hand swung at open air, connecting only randomly with his assailants, doing very little damage, but keeping the fairies at bay. That only worked for a few moments. The fallen macaron sprites were undaunted and quick to pick themselves up and renew their attack. More of the creatures kept emerging from the spilled treats, thrusting themselves into the fray. Orleans, usually so poised and calm and jovial, spun around dervish-like, trying first to scare the sprites away, but soon concentrating only on protecting himself from the attack.
"Ouch!"
A second bite. It wasn't as deep as the first one, at least judging by the volume and alarm in Orleans' voice, but it also wasn't the last. Like a beekeeper who lost control of his hive, the Inquisitor spun and danced around, swatting with his one free hand, trying to keep the cloud of colorful, vengeful sprites away. It was a losing battle. As hard as he would hit the fairies, the worst damage he would inflict is knocking 1 or 2 back for a few seconds. They would never stay down. Always they'd pick themselves up, stretch their tiny wings anew, and fly right back into the fray.
"The cage, Orleans!"
I screamed.
"Drop the cage!"
Nips and lines of crimson pain were appearing all over his neck and on his hands. The wounds leaked with abandon, and large drops of blood stained the pristine white cuffs of his shirt, soon dripping onto the floor. The sprites, like piranhas, frenzied at the smell and taste. One of them stopped to lick its red lips and savor the taste of Orleans before going back in for seconds. With a deafening clatter, the cage hit the tiles just behind the register. The Inquisitor didn't settle for loosening his grip on the relic, but tossed it away as far as his draining strength would allow. The fragile contraption collapsed upon impact, folding in on itself once again. Purple smoke, accompanied by an inhuman scream, escaped the wreckage. The prisoner struggled to free itself from debris as it burned skin and flesh, leaving deep violet scorch lines all over its body. The attack did not let up. Finally, Orleans lost his footing or ran out of strength, falling first to his knees and then into the mountain of macarons. His hand reached up, trying to hold onto the side of the counter, but managing only to paint it with a red handprint. There was a moment, about the length of half a breath, during which the Inquisitor lay still and quiet, as dozens of macaron sprites, each of a unique tint and hue, took bites out of his exposed skin.
"Help,"
he whimpered, expending what must have been the last of his strength.
"Orleans?"
Alessandria didn't settle with letting go of my shoulder, but rather pushed me clear out of her way with all her might, running to help her beleaguered partner.
Ugh.
I slid on the ceramic tiles, hitting my head on the threshold of the back door, the one that leads to the alley behind the cafe. When I opened my eyes, it was to a sideways view of the unfolding drama. Olivia sat, crouched where she'd been during the whole adventure. The woman I came to consider my Aquilo mother looked back and forth between me and the Inquisitors, unsure who to assist. "Go," I ordered, waving my hand in her direction. I'd bumped my head. Meanwhile, Orléans was being devoured alive by vicious fairies. It wasn't hard for me to decide where our priorities were. Propping myself up on my shoulder, I watched as Alessandria pulled fistful after fistful of macaron sprites from her friend. Olivia joined in, swatting at the creatures with her huge purse. The scene would have been comical if it wasn't so desperate. But the more of the sprites they knocked away, the more flew in to join the melee. I simply lay there, wondering what I could do, but ultimately doing nothing. That is until...
Ah!
Olivia's voice cut through.
My ear!
The sprites were turning on my first and best friend here in Aquilo. I thought of picking up my wooden spoon and joining the battle myself, thinking that the solution was in front of me. Instead, as I got up, pulling myself to my feet with the doorknob's help, that's when I realized where true salvation was. There are a lot of locks on the back door of the Aquilo. A few were put in after my encounters with a hunger demon that lurked in the alley. Most were installed in a pointless attempt to keep the raccoons out of the cafe. I never removed any of them, though I only lock a few nowadays. Still, it took far longer than I would have preferred releasing every single bolt and chain. Behind me, I could hear Alessandria punch and grunt, occasionally growling what might pass for a battle cry. To this day, I swear I heard her cursing, but I'm not dumb enough to accuse her of taking the Lord's name in vain. The back door exploded open as soon as I pulled the last bolt. I thought I might have to run out there, that I would have to pull open the lid to the dumpster and negotiate for assistance. I wondered that I might have to secure bribes out of the pantry, but no. The commotion inside the cafe must have been enough to alert them. All 6 of my tenants were already atop the dumpster. Some stood, pacing around, while others sat on their furry rumps, waiting to see what was going on. Like a gang leader holding court in the middle of his henchmen and muscle, the king of the trash bandits waited. We made eye contact, and I saw the unnatural blue hint of light in his gaze. The Dawn. A nemesis with whom I held an uneasy truce. I'd purchased my peace with the raccoons by feeding them the leftovers from the display case every day. That night, I was going to learn whether I'd bought more than that. "You want macarons?" I asked, a challenge in my voice. "Go get 'em." Standing aside from the door, I waved my arm to the inside of the cafe. Seldom, if ever, would I offer an open invitation to the raccoons. Not all of them. Once in a while, my favorite amongst them was allowed to join me in the dining room. But to have all 6 of these animals roaming the Aquilo Cafe? They didn't have to be asked twice. The Don was quick to kick every one of his court into action. Crimson, a raccoon with a faded red tag on his ear, and by far the most belligerent of the lot, was the first across the threshold. Brioche, my favorite, followed quickly, and soon all of them were loping their way toward the display. They ignored the pandemonium, paying little to no attention to the sprites and their victims. Crimson snarled at Alessandria when she nearly stepped on his tail, but otherwise their attention was focused completely on the macarons, the dozens upon dozens of macarons. There were 2 feeding frenzies vying for the same space in my cafe. The sprites vengefully attacking the Inquisitors and Olivia, and the raccoons trying to devour thrice their own volume in macarons. It didn't take long before the 2 events came into conflict. Either a sprite tried to bite a raccoon, or a raccoon attempted to eat a sprite, but once the battle was joined, things escalated quickly. We didn't stick around to watch the show. Once the sprites were distracted, I ran in to help Olivia out of the cafe. Alessandria did the same for Orléans. "He's going to need a doctor," Alessandria said, a rare human level of compassion and fear in her words. She wasn't kidding. While Olivia had a nip missing from her left ear just above the lobe, Orléans was covered in his own blood. The macaron sprites had nearly devoured the skin on his neck and did significant damage to his face. In time, he made a full recovery, but on that night, I thought he'd die right there. Another body added to the tally behind the Aquilo. It took a few hours before I could go back into the cafe. Part of me didn't want to. I was terrified of what I would find there. My raccoons, the Aquilo raccoons, aren't ordinary animals. I'm told they're immortal. Had I sacrificed them just to save the Inquisitors and Olivia? Would the Sprite still be there, ready to pounce anew? Once I was reassured that Orleans would be fine, I did go back to the Aquilo. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Olivia had asked when I slid the key into the front door.
"I can ask Henry to check it out in the morning."
Through the front window, I could see no activity, no movement. Whatever had happened was over with. "No," I answered, pulling the door open and setting the chimes to sing their song. "Best to get this over with now. Are you sure you want to come with me?" "Mm-hmm." The cafe was quiet and dark, with only the light of the display to illuminate the dining room. The display was empty. There was no doubt that a battle had been fought there. The metal baskets in which I lay my baked goods on gingham paper during the day were tossed aside and flipped over. There were crumbs of infinite colors at the bottom of the display, speckled with only a few drops of blood. Looking over the counter, on the floor behind the register, I could see the pieces of the cage of St. Gallen. Of the raccoons and sprites, there was no trace. "You go see if your vermin are okay," Olivia said, pulling up her sleeves and setting her purse on the counter. There was a thick bandage on her ear where there would soon be a scar of a missing bite. "I'll get started mopping this all up." She wasn't kidding either. The floor behind the counter was slick with blood. Orleans mostly, but also some of Alessandria's and Olivia's. Maybe even some raccoon blood. When I looked outside, the alley was empty, save for the 2 large, rusty green dumpsters where I tossed the waste that comes from running a coffee shop and bakery. Heart racing, I pushed open the lid of the nearest dumpster and, with great relief, but also a good measure of disgust, there were the raccoons. Lying asleep upon a hill of macarons, like dragons atop their hoard, all 6 raccoons snored. They were all covered in blood, having rolled around in the mess on the Aquilo's floor. There was something both reassuring to see their chests move up and down as they snored, but disturbing as I contemplated what must have unfolded after we left. Did they kill all the sprites? Eat them? To this day, I don't have an answer to that. It was impressive how they carried all of the macarons back to their home, however, which I was glad for. It would take a long time before I was okay with the sight of macarons again. I reached down into the trash, extending my arm so I could reach Brioche, my favorite. I petted her, suppressing my disgust at the matted blood in her fur. And that's when I heard it. A cooing and a gurgle. It made my heart sink and my muscles freeze. Only my eyes moved, slowly panning towards the source of the noise. There, half buried in the mountain of meringues, was a single surviving macaron sprite. Not just any macaron sprite, but a purple and blue one with streaks of violet burns and a missing wing. Well, I thought, it would be cruel to just leave it in the dumpster, wouldn't it? Aquilo is written by J.F. Dubow and narrated and produced by me, Amy Frost. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. Want to support the show? Buy us a coffee. Go to ko-fi.com/Aquilo to donate. Aquilo has a Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Aquilo for details. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the username Aquilo.